Good morning, everyone, and today I'm bringing you the first in a series of knitting tutorials that I'm going to be posting. So when you're getting into knitting, one of the first things you're going to do is probably start collecting tools. So let's take a look at some of the things commonly used in knitting. Alright, so we're going to go over here, and what you're looking at is a bunch of different kinds of cable needles. These are needles that are used to do cable stitches. They do come in different sizes, different materials, mostly plastic and metal. You can see that they are notched to make sure that your cable doesn't slide. And they come in real handy, so get yourself a good variety of cable needles. Cables are generally used by more advanced knitters, but having a good supply of cable needles is very important. Moving on up, we are going to look at what are called stitch markers. These things are completely irreplaceable. You use them to mark rows, you use them to mark stitches when you're getting into working with patterns. So these things are very, very important. They come in different styles, different sizes, and it's really up to you what kind you prefer. Myself, I prefer the little plastic safety pin ones. The only issue with those is that the set that I have is actually hard plastic, so if you're not careful they will snap because they're not that sturdy. But get yourself some good stitch markers. Alright, so we're going to move on up this way, and these are little doodads, needle protectors, whatever, I can't remember what they're called, but they actually slip onto the point of your needle to save your work and also to protect the tips of your needles. So those are important. This is a little bit of an extra. It's actually a stitch counter, and it wraps right around your finger, and as you are knitting, you can click and count your rows. So that really comes in handy. Moving on up, we have your standard stitch guide or stitch gauge, which is going to tell you how many stitches per inch, and that is going to come in very handy when you're working with patterns or you're trying to figure out how many stitches to cast on. So we're going to move on down to the needles themselves. I'm starting off with your standard straight needles here. You have different materials and types. Now these are hard plastic needles. These are bamboo needles, which are great for beginners because they tend to hold your stitches a little better. These are older, more flexible plastic needles. And these are metal needles. Now the thing about metal needles is that when you're working with metal needles, they really do have a tendency to be very slick. So if you're not careful and you're knitting, you can actually lose your work and end up skipping stitches because they will slide, your work will slide right off the end. So if you're new and you're working with metal needles, it's a good idea to keep your stitches right about back here and then move them up as you go. Now I generally don't use my straight needles anymore. Oops, sorry. These are a set of needles. These are 35, I think. And these are used for like really chunky wool and heavy projects. Okay, so as I was saying, I generally do not use straight needles anymore. I use circular needles. This is actually two sets of Hiya needles. Now, when you're working with circular needles, these are great because the cable attaches to the ends of these needles. And this set runs from 3 to I think it's 9 or 10. So you're working in the round, and even with a straight project, you're not going to lose your work because when you put it aside, you can just slide it on down onto your cable. Now, most cable sets come with a variety of length of needles. Mine run from 12 inches to 40, 42. And I work with cable needles even when I'm doing straight projects such as scarves or whatnot. I prefer it. There's all kinds of really good circular needle sets out there. Like I said, Haya is my favorite. But again, these are metal needles. So you have to be really careful about losing your work when you're working with metal needles. They're extremely slick. If you're new, I recommend starting off with a cheap set of bamboo needles so you can get the feel of actually knitting. Moving on over here, we have double pointed needles. These are used when you're working in the round, such as maybe knitting socks or knitting hats or anything that requires you to work something like that. So the double pointed needles are used for knitting in the round. Again, I don't generally use my double pointed needles because I do have my set of circulars, but these are great. They're fairly cheap to buy. So if you can't afford a really nice set of circular needles, then you can go out and get yourself a set of double points. So, and then of course, last but not least, is our handy dandy snips to cut our yarn. So these are just some of the tools that knitters use, knitters need, and we're going to be working. I'm going to be working on a series on casting on and doing various stitches. So I hope that you'll hit that like or subscribe button, and I'll see you next time. Bye.